Welcome to Quiet Car Stories. In this video, we'll take a slow and relaxing journey through the history of cars, engines, and the quiet details of automotive engineering. If you enjoy calm storytelling and gentle explanations, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps support these kinds of long-form, relaxing documentaries. You're welcome to simply sit back and listen. Whether you're here to learn something new, unwind after a long day, or even drift off to sleep, these stories are made to be enjoyed quietly at your own pace. So find a comfortable position, settle in, and let the sound of the story carry you. Let's begin. There is a certain rhythm to driving that over time has begun to feel less familiar. It is not loud or dramatic or immediately noticeable. It does not demand attention. Instead, it exists in small, repeated movements. The steady press of a clutch pedal beneath the left foot, the gentle guidance of a gear lever from one position to another, the subtle coordination between engine speed and road speed. For many decades, this rhythm was simply part of driving. It was expected, it was learned, and for the most part, it was never questioned. But as time has passed, this way of interacting with a car has begun to change. The manual transmission, once the standard method of controlling power in an automobile, is gradually becoming less common. Not through a sudden disappearance or a single defining moment, but through a slow and steady process, a quiet shift. To understand how this happened, it helps to return to the earliest days of the automobile, when the relationship between engine and motion was still being defined. At the end of the 19th century, the first cars were not yet standardized machines. They were experimental, often hand-built, and varied widely in their design. Some used chains to transfer power, others relied on belts. Many were limited in both speed and reliability. But across all of these early designs, one challenge remained constant. Engines, by their nature, produce power within a limited range of speeds. They cannot easily adapt to the full range of conditions required for driving, from starting at rest to traveling at higher speeds. To solve this, engineers needed a way to vary how that power was delivered to the wheels. The solution came in the form of gearing. By introducing different gear ratios, it became possible to match engine output to road speed more effectively. Early gear systems were simple, but they required direct control. The driver had to choose the appropriate gear and, importantly, had to manage the transition between gears. These early transmissions were unsynchronized. The gears themselves did not automatically match speeds before engagement. If a driver attempted to shift without properly aligning the speeds, the result was often a harsh grinding sound. To avoid this, a technique known as double clutching became necessary. The process was deliberate. The driver would press the clutch pedal and move the gear lever into neutral. Then release the clutch, adjust the engine speed to match the next gear, press the clutch again, and complete the shift. It was not intuitive. It required attention, timing, and practice. Driving, in these early years, was not a passive activity. It demanded involvement, and the manual transmission was central to that involvement. Over time, as automotive engineering progressed, efforts were made to simplify this process. One of the most significant developments came with the introduction of synchromesh gearboxes. These systems, which began appearing in the early 20th century, and became more widespread in the 1920s and 1930s, allowed gears to match speeds automatically before engagement. This reduced the need for precise timing, it made shifting smoother, and it made driving more accessible to a wider range of people. With synchromesh, the act of changing gears became less mechanical and more fluid. At the same time, the layout of vehicle controls became more standardized. The three-pedal arrangement, clutch, brake, and accelerator, became widely adopted. The gear lever was positioned for ease of use. These conventions created a sense of familiarity across different vehicles. By the mid-20th century, the manual transmission had established itself as the dominant system in passenger cars across much of the world. It was reliable, mechanically straightforward, and efficient. Importantly, it also provided a direct connection between the driver and the machine. Each gear change was a conscious action. Each movement influenced how the car responded. Driving became a continuous interaction, a process that required attention but also offered a sense of control. For many drivers, this interaction became part of the experience. It was not simply about reaching a destination. It was about how the journey felt. Learning to drive meant learning how to operate a manual gearbox. It meant understanding how to balance engine speed with vehicle speed. It meant developing a feel for the car. In many countries, this was not optional. Driving tests required proficiency with a manual transmission. And as a result, generations of drivers became familiar with this system. At the same time, however, alternative approaches were being explored. In the early 20th century, engineers began developing automatic transmissions. These systems aimed to remove the need for manual gear selection. Instead of requiring the driver to choose gears, the transmission would do so automatically. The earliest practical automatic transmissions began to appear in the 1940s, particularly in the United States. One of the most notable early examples was the hydromatic transmission, introduced by General Motors. These systems used a combination of torque converters and planetary gear sets to shift gears smoothly without interrupting power delivery. The goal was convenience, to simplify driving, to reduce the level of effort required, and in certain contexts this approach proved appealing. In the United States, where driving often involved long distances and relatively low traffic congestion, automatic transmissions gained popularity. They allowed drivers to focus less on the mechanics of driving and more on the act of travel itself. However, early automatics had limitations. They were less efficient than manual transmissions. They consumed more fuel. They were often heavier and more complex. And in terms of performance, they were not always as responsive. As a result, their adoption varied across different regions. In Europe and other parts of the world, where fuel efficiency and cost were more significant considerations, manual transmissions remained dominant. For several decades, both systems coexisted, each suited to different priorities, each evolving in its own way. During this time, manual transmissions continued to improve. Gearboxes gained additional gears, allowing engines to operate more efficiently across a wider range of speeds. 5-speed transmissions became common. Later, 6-speed gearboxes offered even greater flexibility. Clutch systems became lighter and easier to operate. Gear shifts became smoother and more precise. The overall experience of driving a manual car became more refined. In performance vehicles, the manual transmission held a particular significance. It allowed drivers to control exactly when to shift, to keep the engine within its optimal power band, to engage more directly with the mechanics of the car. For many enthusiasts, this level of control was not just functional, it was meaningful. The act of driving became more engaging, more deliberate, more connected, and for a long time, this connection was considered an essential part of the driving experience. The presence of the manual transmission during this period was so widespread that it was rarely discussed. It did not need explanation. It was simply how cars worked, and yet, even at this point, when the manual gearbox seemed firmly established, the foundations of change were already forming. They did not arrive suddenly. They developed gradually, through small improvements, quiet innovations, and shifting expectations. Automatic transmissions, which had once been limited by inefficiency and complexity, began to improve. Advances in hydraulic systems allowed for smoother gear changes. Materials became stronger and more durable. And perhaps most importantly, the introduction of electronic control systems transformed how transmissions operated. By the late 20th century, automatic gearboxes were no longer purely mechanical systems. They could respond to inputs. They could adjust to driving conditions. They could make decisions. Sensors began to monitor speed, throttle position, and load. Control units processed this information and determined the optimal time to change gear. The result was a system that could operate with increasing precision, in many cases more consistently than a human driver. At first, the differences were subtle. Manual transmissions still offered advantages in efficiency and control. They remained lighter, simpler, and, for many, more engaging. But the gap was narrowing. As automatic transmissions improved, they began to match manual gearboxes in areas where they had once lagged behind. Fuel consumption became more comparable, reliability increased, and in some situations, automatics began to offer smoother, more refined driving experiences. Then, Another development began to shift the balance further: the introduction of dual-clutch transmissions. These systems represented a different approach. Rather than using a torque converter, dual-clutch gearboxes employed two separate clutches, one for odd-numbered gears and one for even-numbered gears. This allowed the transmission to prepare the next gear in advance. When a shift was required, one clutch would disengage as the other engaged. The result was a gear change that was both rapid and seamless. Power delivery was maintained, interruptions were minimized, and shifts could occur far more quickly than with a traditional manual gearbox. For performance vehicles, this was significant. Acceleration improved, consistency improved, and lap times, where measured, often became faster. The role of the driver in gear selection began to diminish. Where once timing and skill were required, the system could now perform the same task with greater speed and precision. At the same time, continuously variable transmissions introduced yet another alternative. Rather than fixed gears, these systems used variable ratios to provide a smooth and uninterrupted flow of power. There were no distinct gear changes, no steps between ratios. Instead, the engine could operate at its most efficient speed while the transmission adjusted continuously. For everyday driving, this created a different kind of experience, one that prioritized smoothness and efficiency over mechanical involvement. As these technologies developed, the advantages of the manual transmission became less defined. It was still simpler in many respects, still mechanically direct, still capable of providing a level of engagement that other systems could not replicate. But in measurable terms, efficiency, performance, ease of use, it was no longer clearly superior. And as the automotive world continued to evolve, these measurable factors began to carry more weight. Driving conditions were also changing. Urban environments became more congested. Traffic became more frequent, more dense, more unpredictable. In these conditions, operating a manual transmission required constant input, frequent clutch engagement, repeated gear changes, small adjustments made continuously. For some, this remained part of the appeal, but for many others it became less desirable. Automatic transmissions offered a simpler alternative. They reduced effort. They allowed the driver to focus on steering and braking. They removed the need for constant coordination. Gradually, convenience began to take precedence. Consumer preferences began to shift. In markets such as the United States, where automatics had already been common, they became almost universal. In Europe and other regions, where manual transmissions had remained dominant for longer, the transition was slower, but it came. As automatic systems improved, their adoption increased. Manufacturers responded, offering fewer manual variants, investing more heavily in automatic and semi-automatic technologies. At the same time, regulatory pressures began to influence design decisions. Fuel economy standards became stricter. Emissions targets became more demanding. Meeting these requirements required precise control over engine operation. Automatic transmissions, with their ability to manage gear selection electronically, provided advantages. They could optimize engine speed for efficiency. They could adapt to different driving conditions in real time. They could operate in a way that was consistent and repeatable. Manual transmissions, by contrast, depended on driver input. Two drivers operating the same vehicle could achieve different levels of efficiency depending on how they shifted gears. From a regulatory perspective, this variability became a disadvantage. As a result, the manual gearbox began to lose ground, not because it was incapable, but because it was less aligned with emerging priorities. In performance vehicles, the shift became more visible. Where manual transmissions had once been standard, many manufacturers began to move toward dual clutch, or advanced automatic systems. These offered faster gear changes, improved acceleration, and greater consistency under demanding conditions. In measurable terms, they were often superior. For manufacturers, this mattered. Performance figures could be quantified. Acceleration times could be compared. And in these comparisons, automated systems frequently performed better. The manual transmission, once central to the performance driving experience, became less common. Not entirely absent, but no longer dominant. And yet, despite these changes, the manual gearbox retained something that was not easily replaced: a sense of involvement, a connection between driver and machine that was both physical and immediate. Each gear change required participation. Each movement required awareness. For those who valued this, the manual transmission remained significant. But for a growing number of drivers, this level of involvement was no longer necessary. Driving had changed. It had become more about convenience, more about efficiency, more about ease. The relationship between driver and car had shifted from active participation to guided operation. And in this shift, the role of the manual transmission continued to diminish. And as this gradual transition continued, another development began to reshape the landscape even further. The rise of electrification. Electric vehicles do not rely on the same principles as internal combustion engines. They do not require a narrow operating range to produce power. They do not depend on increasing engine speed to build torque. Instead, electric motors are capable of delivering torque almost instantly, across a wide range of speeds. Because of this, the need for multiple gear ratios is greatly reduced. In many cases, it is removed entirely. Most electric vehicles operate using a single-speed transmission. There is no clutch, no gear lever, no sequence of shifts. Power is delivered smoothly and continuously, without interruption. For the driver, the experience is different, simpler, more immediate, and, in many ways, more detached from the mechanical processes that once defined driving. This shift does not directly replace the manual transmission, but it changes the environment in which it exists. As electric vehicles become more common, the relevance of traditional gearboxes, manual or automatic, begins to diminish. The manual transmission, already in decline, becomes even more limited in its application. It remains present in certain areas, in specific, enthusiast vehicles, in regions where manual driving is still part of the culture, but its presence is no longer widespread. The change continues quietly. A manufacturer announces that a new model will no longer offer a manual option. Another introduces an updated version of a car, available only with an automatic transmission. A performance vehicle, once associated with manual driving, transitions to a dual clutch system. Each decision is small, each one understandable in isolation. But together they form a pattern. The manual transmission is gradually stepping away from its place in everyday driving. And yet, even as it becomes less common, it does not disappear entirely. There remains a group of drivers who continue to value it, not for efficiency, not for convenience, but for the experience it provides. The manual gearbox offers something that cannot be easily replicated by automated systems. A sense of timing, a requirement for attention, a physical connection between input and response. It is not necessarily faster, not necessarily more efficient, but it is more involved. For those who appreciate this, the manual transmission remains meaningful. It represents a way of driving that is more deliberate, more engaged, more aware. But this perspective is not universal. For many drivers, the priorities have shifted. Ease of use has become more important. Consistency has become more valuable. Technology has advanced to the point where much of the complexity of driving can be managed automatically. And as a result, the role of the driver has changed. The act of driving has become less about managing the machine and more about guiding it. In this context, the manual transmission becomes less essential. It is no longer required to achieve efficiency. It is no longer necessary for performance. It is no longer expected as part of the driving experience. Instead, it becomes optional. And over time, as fewer people choose it, manufacturers respond by offering it less frequently. This is how the decline continues, not through a single decision, but through many small ones. A gradual reduction in availability, a slow shift in preference, a quiet change in expectation. If we step back and consider the full arc of this story, a pattern begins to emerge. The manual transmission was not replaced because it was flawed. For more than a century, it served its purpose effectively. It provided control. It offered efficiency. It created a direct link between driver and machine. Its decline is not the result of failure, but of change. The world around it evolved. Technology advanced. Priorities shifted. And the conditions that once made the manual transmission essential gradually gave way to new possibilities. In many ways, the manual gearbox represents a particular era of engineering, an era where mechanical systems required human input, where skill and coordination were part of everyday operation, where driving was an active process. That era has not disappeared entirely, but it has become less central. The manual transmission remains as a reminder of that time, a reminder of how machines were once operated, of how drivers once interacted with their vehicles. It continues to exist in certain contexts, in enthusiast cars, in specialized applications, in places where the experience itself is still valued, but it is no longer the default, no longer the expectation. And perhaps that is the most defining aspect of its decline. Not that it is gone, but that it is no longer assumed. Its presence has shifted from standard to selective, from necessary to optional, from common to uncommon. And this shift has happened gradually, almost quietly, without a clear beginning or end, which, in many ways, reflects the nature of the manual transmission itself. It was never about automation, never about removing effort. It required participation, attention, a certain rhythm. And as the automotive world continues to move toward greater automation, toward systems that require less input, that prioritize ease and efficiency, that rhythm becomes less common, not lost entirely, but heard less often, felt less frequently, fading slowly into the background. And yet, for those who have experienced it, the memory remains. The feel of a well-timed shift, the subtle balance between clutch and throttle, the quiet satisfaction of moving through the gears with precision. These are small moments, but they are meaningful ones. They represent a different kind of interaction, a different way of understanding the machine. And as that way becomes less common, what remains is not just a piece of engineering, but a memory of how things once were, a reminder of a time when driving required more, and in return gave something back. Something subtle, something quiet, something that cannot be easily measured. The manual transmission does not end. It simply becomes less present, less visible, less central. And in doing so, it takes its place in the broader story of automotive history, not as a failure, but as a chapter, one that was long and carefully written, and now, gradually, begins to close.